At one point, this was the largest private mansion ever built in America. It belonged to one of the richest families the country has ever known. But today, the house still stands, empty, stripped, and ignored. No scandal, no collapse, just a decision made quietly to walk away. This is Lynnewood Hall, and the story of how even unlimited wealth can be forgotten. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And if you enjoy forgotten American stories like this, subscribe. At the height of America's Gilded Age, when fortunes were measured not in millions, but in influence, there lived a class of families so wealthy they no longer competed with other Americans. They compared themselves to European royalty. Among them stood Peter Arrol Brown Widener, a man whose wealth came not from a single invention or lucky strike, but from positioning himself at the very center of America's rise. Railroads, streetcars, steel interests, shipping, finance. Widener's money moved where the country moved. By the late 19th century, his family was not just rich, they were untouchable. And when men like Widener built homes, they were not thinking about comfort. They were thinking about permanence, dominance, and legacy. That is how Lynnewood Hall was born, not as a house, but as a statement that the Widener name had outgrown America itself. Construction of Lynnewood Hall began in the 1890s on an enormous estate just outside Philadelphia, deliberately set apart from the city, but close enough to watch it grow. The scale was almost absurd by American standards. More than 110 rooms, vast formal halls, imported stone, European architectural inspiration meant to echo palaces rather than private residences. This was not a place designed to feel lived in. It was designed to feel inevitable. At a time when most Americans lived modestly, the Widener family commissioned a mansion that required dozens of full-time staff simply to function. Servants had their own staircases, their own corridors, their own lives hidden behind the walls, so the illusion of effortless luxury could be maintained. Every detail reinforced hierarchy: who belonged where, who was seen, and who was meant to remain invisible. What made Lynnewood Hall extraordinary was not just its size, but its timing. America was still defining itself, still deciding what power looked like outside of monarchy. Families like the Wideners were creating a new aristocracy, one built not on titles, but on capital. Inside Lynnewood, priceless art filled the rooms, much of it collected by Widener himself with an obsessive eye for old-world prestige. Paintings, sculptures, tapestries, objects chosen not for warmth, but for authority. The house was curated like a museum of dominance, a physical reminder that this family did not merely profit from America's growth, they stood above it. Yet even in its prime, Lynnewood Hall carried a strange contradiction. Despite its grandeur, it was never a house filled with public celebration. There were no legendary parties passed down through popular culture, no stories of laughter spilling into the gardens. Instead, accounts describe a controlled, formal atmosphere, quiet, disciplined, almost reverent. The mansion functioned as a retreat from the public eye, not an invitation into it. The Widener family had reached a level of wealth where privacy became more valuable than admiration. And Lynnewood Hall was designed to enforce that privacy absolutely. This isolation would shape everything that followed. The estate existed in its own world, disconnected from ordinary American life, insulated from economic swings that affected everyone else. While cities grew crowded and noisy, Lynnewood remained still. While fortunes rose and fell around it, the mansion stood unchanged, as if daring time to challenge it. But history has a way of testing places built on excess. The same walls that protected the family from scrutiny also separated them from the world that might one day care whether the house survived. At its peak, Lynnewood Hall represented the ultimate success story of American capitalism: unlimited resources, imported culture, and total control over environment. But buried inside that success was a vulnerability few noticed at the time. The house was built to express power, not adaptability. It depended entirely on the family's continued presence, interest, and relevance. And as the next decades would prove, even the richest families are not immune to loss, tragedy, and retreat. Long before Lynnewood was abandoned, stripped, or ignored, its fate was already being shaped by the very ambition that created it. Because when a mansion is built to stand above society rather than within it, the moment its owners step away, it has nowhere left to belong. Life inside Lynnewood Hall did not resemble the glamorous fantasy most people imagine when they hear the word mansion. There was no sense of casual luxury, no warmth that naturally comes from a lived-in home. Instead, the estate functioned like a perfectly calibrated machine designed to preserve order, distance, and control at all costs. Every day followed an unspoken script. Servants moved through the house along routes specifically designed to keep them unseen, using narrow staircases and hidden corridors so that the illusion of effortless wealth was never disturbed. Bells summoned staff instantly. Meals appeared precisely when expected and vanished just as quietly. Nothing was spontaneous. Nothing was accidental. The mansion did not encourage comfort. It enforced discipline. At the center of this world stood Peter Errol Brown Widener, whose authority extended far beyond business and into every corner of domestic life. Widener believed deeply in hierarchy and structure. He had built his fortune by mastering systems. Transportation, finance, logistics, and Lynnewood Hall was simply another system under his control. Family members lived within clearly defined boundaries of behavior. Children were educated to carry themselves with restraint and dignity, constantly aware that they represented a name far larger than themselves. Emotion, when displayed, was measured. Excess, whether joy or anger, was something to be corrected, not indulged. The sheer scale of the mansion amplified this emotional distance. Rooms were enormous, ceilings high, spaces deliberately expansive, creating a sense of separation even among people standing only a few feet apart. Conversations felt smaller inside such vastness. Sound did not travel easily. Voices lowered instinctively. Guests often remarked that Lynnewood felt colder than the weather outside, not in temperature, but in atmosphere. It was a place that seemed to observe its occupants rather than welcome them, as if the walls themselves were enforcing the rules. Despite the presence of priceless art and imported furnishings, the house never developed a reputation as a social hub. The Widener family did not need public admiration. They had already surpassed it. Privacy became the ultimate luxury. As a result, Lynnewood was closed off, both physically and socially. Gates, distance from the city, and strict control over access ensured that very few outsiders ever truly experienced life inside. Those who did rarely spoke of warmth or charm. What they remembered was formality, an overwhelming sense that everything was being managed, contained, and watched. This environment shaped not only the family, but also the staff who kept the mansion running. Hundreds passed through Lynnewood over the years, yet few stayed long. The work was demanding, the expectations exacting, and the emotional climate exhausting. Nothing overtly cruel was recorded, no public accusations ever surfaced, but turnover told its own story. People left quietly, taking with them impressions they seldom shared. Lynnewood was not a place that invited stories. It absorbed them and left no trace. What made this way of life sustainable, for a time, was the Widener fortune itself. Money insulated the family from outside pressure, allowing the mansion to exist almost independently of the world around it. While America changed rapidly, Lynnewood remained frozen in its original purpose. But that stability came at a cost. The house did not evolve. It did not adapt. It demanded continuity in a world defined by change. And slowly, almost invisibly, the seeds of decline were planted. A home built entirely around control depends on constant presence to survive. The moment that presence weakens, structure becomes emptiness. Lynnewood Hall was magnificent, powerful, and seemingly indestructible, but beneath the stone and marble, it was already fragile, waiting for the moment when the family's grip would loosen and the silence inside would grow too loud to ignore. The unraveling of Lynnewood Hall did not begin with financial collapse or public scandal. It began with something far more destabilizing for a family built on control: irreversible personal loss. For the Widener family, wealth had always functioned as insulation, protecting them from the unpredictability of ordinary life. But there was one force it could not neutralize: tragedy. When George Dunton Widener, heir to the Widener fortune, died aboard the Titanic in 1912, along with his young son, the event fractured the emotional foundation of the family. The loss was not only personal, it was existential. The future that Lynnewood Hall had been built to house suddenly vanished, and no amount of money could reconstruct it. From that moment forward, the mansion's atmosphere changed in ways no renovation could repair. The rigid order that once defined life inside Lynnewood began to feel hollow rather than powerful. Rooms that had been symbols of continuity became reminders of absence. The house had been designed to project permanence, yet it was now confronting a reality it could not contain. Peter Arrol Brown Widener, already a man of restraint, withdrew even further inward. Public life diminished. The estate, once a controlled fortress of authority, began to feel like a private memorial frozen in time. This withdrawal was subtle but decisive. The Widener family did not announce a retreat. They simply became less visible. Fewer guests arrived. Entire wings of the mansion went unused. The daily routines continued, but without purpose. Staff sensed it immediately. The difference between discipline and mourning is unmistakable. Where precision once felt intentional, it now felt obligatory. Where silence once represented control, it now represented grief. The tragedy also exposed a critical weakness in Lynnewood's design. It had no emotional flexibility. It was a house built to preserve status, not to absorb loss. There were no smaller, more intimate spaces where healing could occur. Everything was grand, formal, and unyielding. Grief echoed differently in rooms meant for dominance rather than comfort. Over time, the family spent less and less time within the mansion's walls, seeking distance not just from the public, but from the reminders embedded in the structure itself. As the years passed, Lynnewood transitioned from a residence to a relic, still maintained, still impressive, but increasingly irrelevant to the lives of those who owned it. The estate no longer represented the future of the Widener family. It represented a past that could not be revisited without pain. And so, without any dramatic decision or public declaration, the family began to step away. The house remained, but its role in their lives diminished until it was little more than a burden of scale and memory. This was the true turning point. Not abandonment, not decay, but emotional detachment. Once Lynnewood lost its meaning, its fate was sealed. A mansion of that size cannot survive on maintenance alone. It needs purpose, presence, and belief. And by the time the Widener family withdrew completely, Lynnewood Hall was no longer a home. It was a monument to a legacy that had already moved on. The turning point for Lynnewood Hall did not arrive with bankruptcy, scandal, or public disgrace. It arrived quietly, through loss, and through a realization that even immense wealth cannot protect a family from time. For years, the mansion had existed as a promise of continuity, built to carry the Widener name forward through generations. But that promise depended on something money could not guarantee: a future that felt worth inhabiting. When that future fractured, the meaning of the house fractured with it. What followed was not an immediate abandonment, but a slow, emotional withdrawal that proved far more destructive than neglect ever could. After tragedy reshaped the Widener family's inner world, Lynnewood began to feel oversized in a way it never had before. Rooms that once symbolized legacy now amplified absence. The scale that had been designed to inspire awe became oppressive, turning memory into architecture. The mansion did not allow grief to pass gently, it preserved it. Every corridor led back to what had been lost. Every formal space reminded its occupants of expectations that would never again be fulfilled in the way they had imagined. And so, without making a public decision, the family began spending less time there. Not because they could not afford it, but because the house no longer served a purpose that felt human. This shift altered everything. Staff numbers were quietly reduced. Entire wings were closed off, not from decay, but from irrelevance. Maintenance continued, but only enough to preserve appearance, not vitality. The estate remained impressive to the eye, yet hollow in function. The routines that once gave Lynnewood its rigid order persisted out of habit, not belief. And habits, when detached from meaning, slowly collapse under their own weight. The Widener fortune still existed. Influence still followed the family name, but Lynnewood was no longer central to that identity. The world was changing, new forms of wealth, new cities, new ways of living, and the mansion felt anchored to an era that had quietly ended. What had once been a symbol of dominance now felt like an obligation, inherited rather than a future embraced. In that way, Lynnewood became something dangerous to legacy, a reminder of a peak that could not be reclaimed. The most telling sign of decline was not physical damage, but indifference. The family did not fight to reinvent the estate. They did not open it to the public, modernize it, or reshape it into something new. They simply let it stand, unchanged, as their lives moved elsewhere. And when powerful families stop believing in the places that once defined them, those places rarely survive for long. By the time Lynnewood's role diminished to that of a seldom-used property, its fate was already sealed. The house had been built to project permanence, but permanence requires participation. Without presence, even stone palaces become fragile. Lynnewood Hall did not fall suddenly. It was left behind step by step until silence replaced intention, and the mansion became a relic waiting for the world to decide what to do with it next. Once the Widener family's emotional connection to Lynnewood Hall was broken, the mansion entered the most dangerous phase in the life of any great estate: usefulness without love. It still stood, immense and imposing, but it no longer represented a future worth protecting. What followed was not an act of destruction, but something quieter and far more final: systematic neglect disguised as practicality. The cost of maintaining a 110-room palace had become unjustifiable, not because the family lacked money, but because the house no longer held meaning. Slowly, almost methodically, Lynnewood was emptied. Priceless art was removed. Marble, fixtures and architectural details were stripped away. Entire interiors were sold off piece by piece, as if the mansion were being dismantled from the inside out, reduced to raw structure without ceremony or regret. This was not vandalism, it was liquidation, and that distinction matters. Lynnewood was not destroyed by outsiders, it was undone by those who no longer needed it. As materials were removed, rooms grew colder, echoing with absence rather than purpose. Windows darkened, doors were sealed, maintenance shifted from care to containment. The goal was no longer to preserve life inside the house, but to prevent it from becoming a problem. Over time, the estate passed through different hands, none of which were willing or able to restore it to its former significance. Restoration would have required belief. No one believed anymore. The surrounding world moved on faster than the mansion could. Development pressures grew, land values rose. Lynnewood became an inconvenience, too large to ignore, too expensive to revive, too symbolic to repurpose easily. Its identity worked against it. It was not quaint, it was not charming, it was overwhelming. and so it was allowed to sit, decaying in full view, yet strangely absent from public conversation. Locals knew it existed. Historians mentioned it briefly. But there was no movement to save it. Silence replaced legacy. By the time Lynnewood was widely recognized as abandoned, its fate had already been decided. A mansion built to outlast generations could not survive indifference. Without restoration, without purpose, without emotional investment, it became a shell, monumental, hollow, and increasingly irrelevant. And in that state, even the greatest structures lose their protection. What once symbolized the peak of American wealth was now simply an empty landmark waiting for erasure, its downfall not marked by collapse, but by quiet acceptance that no one was coming back. By the time the fate of Lynnewood Hall became a matter of public awareness, the most important decision had already been made, not in a courtroom or a planning office, but in silence. There was no single moment when America chose not to save the mansion. There was only a long series of pauses, delays, and indifference that added up to abandonment. This is the part of the story that unsettles historians the most, because Lynnewood did not disappear due to scandal, bankruptcy, or disaster. It vanished because it no longer fit the story America wanted to tell about wealth. Preserving it would have required confronting an uncomfortable truth, that extreme power often builds places too rigid to survive the future. Lynnewood was not a cozy relic of craftsmanship or community. It was a monument to hierarchy, isolation, and excess. Saving it would have meant preserving a symbol of a ruling class that modern America quietly prefers to forget. The Widener name itself still carried respect, but respect is not the same as attachment. As generations passed, emotional distance grew. The mansion represented a past defined by control and formality, not by warmth or shared memory. For later heirs, Lynnewood was less a home than a responsibility, an enormous, expensive reminder of an era that no longer aligned with how wealth wished to present itself. Modern legacy favors philanthropy, accessibility, and curated public narratives. Lynnewood offered none of that. It was too honest in what it represented, too massive, too unapologetic, and so it became easier to let it deteriorate than to explain it. Public institutions, too, hesitated. Restoration would have required enormous funding and a clear purpose. Was Lynnewood a museum, a monument, a warning? No single answer satisfied everyone, and without a clean narrative, preservation lost momentum. Cities are efficient at remembering what can be marketed and forgetting what complicates progress. As development pressures increased, the mansion's land became more valuable than its history. What remained of Lynnewood was not actively destroyed. It was simply outpaced by a future that had no room for it. This is why Lynnewood's story feels so unsettling. It proves that history does not always erase with force. Sometimes it erases by neglect, by allowing a place to linger until saving it feels impractical, unnecessary, or emotionally inconvenient. In the end, Lynnewood Hall was not rejected, it was outgrown. And in that quiet process, one of the greatest private residences ever built in America slipped into irrelevance, leaving behind a question that lingers long after the walls were stripped and the rooms emptied. If a mansion built for America's richest family could be allowed to fade without protest, what does that say about how fragile legacy really is? When people speak about forgotten places, they often search for ghosts, scandals, or dramatic endings. But Lynnewood Hall offers something far more unsettling than a haunted ruin. It offers a mirror. Built at the height of American confidence, the mansion was designed to last longer than the people who lived inside it. Stone, marble, imported art, and endless rooms were meant to freeze power in place, to make wealth feel permanent and unquestionable. Yet today, Lynnewood stands as proof that permanence is an illusion when it is not supported by meaning. The house did not fail because it was poorly built. It failed because the world that required it disappeared. Lynnewood teaches us that legacy is not preserved by scale, money, or reputation alone. It survives only when people continue to believe in what a place represents. For a time, the Widener family believed Lynnewood embodied their future. When that belief faded, through tragedy, change, and emotional withdrawal, the mansion lost its anchor. No foundation, however massive, can compensate for that. What remains is a structure without a story people are willing to carry forward, and structures like that eventually fall outside of history's protection. There is something deeply modern in this outcome. In an age that celebrates innovation, mobility, and reinvention, places built on absolute hierarchy struggle to find relevance. Lynnewood was never meant to evolve. It was meant to stand above society, not within it. And when society changed, the house had no way to change with it. That is why it could be stripped, abandoned, and ignored without public outrage. It no longer fit the values people wanted reflected back at them. Perhaps the most uncomfortable lesson Lynnewood leaves behind is this: power is remembered only as long as it remains useful. Once it becomes inconvenient, it is quietly set aside. Not destroyed, not condemned, just left to decay. Lynnewood was not erased by enemies or critics. It was erased by progress that had no patience for symbols of excess without purpose. And so the mansion's silence becomes its final message, not about tragedy or loss, but about impermanence, about how even the richest families cannot build something immune to time, and how the greatest structures can vanish not through collapse, but through disinterest. Lynnewood Hall stands as a warning hidden in plain sight. Legacy is not what you build. It is what the future chooses to remember. If you've watched this far, you now understand why this mansion matters. Not because of what it was, but because of how easily it was allowed to fade.